All right, we're going to go ahead and go over dividing radicals. The homework is worksheet number 8. So we're just going to go ahead and start with our first example. So we want to take the square root of 49 over 100. Well, when you have a fraction under a radical, you are actually able to rewrite this using two radicals. So we could have the radical 49 over radical 100. The reason this is helpful is because those are perfect squares. So the square root of 49 is just 7, and the square root of 100 is just 10. So my final answer would be 7/10. So when we have a fraction, we cannot have a radical in the bottom. So this is one way that we're able to remove the radical, is if we can end up with a perfect square in the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and do the square root of 8 over 32. So if I go ahead and I do this, the square root of 8 over the square root of 32, neither of those are perfect squares. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to reduce my fraction. And so remember, when we reduce a fraction, we go ahead and divide the numerator and the denominator by the same number. So I'm going to go ahead and divide them both by 8. And so what that's going to allow me to have is the square root of 1 over the square root of 4. Well, the square root of 1 is 1, and the square root of 4 is just 2. So my final answer would be 1/2. Going to the third example, the square root of 3/16. So we're going to go ahead, the square root of 3 over the square root of 16. The square root of 3, we don't know. It does not break up any further, so we're just going to go ahead and leave that as the square root of 3. And the square root of 16 is 4. We have done our job in not having a denominator with a radical. So that would be our final answer. All right, so we're going to go ahead and look here. The square root of 96 and the square root of 3, neither of those are perfect square roots, so I can't simplify that way. So I'm going to look to reduce them. So I can divide both of these by 3. So that would give me the square root of 32 over the square root of 1. Well, the square root of 1 is just 1, so I would have the square root of 32 over 1, which is just the square root of 32. But we can simplify that. And so we always want to break it up. Your final answer for any problem should not have a perfect square root, or not a perfect square root, a perfect square factor under the radical. And so what we're going to do is we're going to break this into radical 16 and radical 2, so that my final answer would become 4 square root of 2. All right, looking at the next one, we're going to go ahead and simplify those radicals. So when we are dividing to simplify, you can only divide under the radical with under the radical. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide these by 6, and I'm just going to ignore that 7 out in front. That does not get divided. And so that's just going to come over. If I take 108 divided by 6, I get 18. And if I take 6 divided by 6, I get 1. So hopefully you're starting to see that radical 1 on the bottom is just 1, which means it's no longer there. So we would have 7 radical 18. It's not that it's no longer there, but we don't need to write it. So we can break up radical 18 into radical 9 and radical 2. So this would become a 3. So 7 times 3 gives me 21 radical 2 for my answer. All right, number 3 here, or not number 3, I'm sorry, the 3 is in the problem. I'm going to go ahead, 5 and 45 are not perfect squares, so I'm going to reduce them. I can divide them both by 5. So I would have 3 radical 1 over radical 9. Well, 3 radical 1 is just 3, because radical 1 is 1, and radical 9 is 3. So I have the fraction 3 over 3, which reduces down to a final answer of 1.